This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Dr. Peter Feaver, who is a professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University and who runs their Duke program in American Grand Strategy, Duke University. They discussed Dr. Feaver's new book, Thanks for Your Service, which analyzes the public confidence in the U.S. military, the implications on public policy, national defense, and the ongoing politicization of the armed forces.
Dr. Peter Feaver, welcome to Reaganism.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You are professor of political science and public policy at Duke. You're here today because your latest book recently came out called Thanks for Your Service: The Causes and Consequences of Public Confidence in the U.S. Military. Congrats on the book, Peter. Tell me what brought you to write this book.
Well, I'm really playing off of something I wrote 25 years ago with a colleague named Paul Gronke, where we looked at public confidence in the military in the late 90s, and we said it was uncertain, it was high but brittle. And it was high in the wake of Desert Storm, but we looked at the pillars that undergird it, and we said they're likely to crack, and we expected public confidence in the military to drop. And if you put a pin in a time series analysis of public confidence in the military, right when we made that prediction, which was about September 10th, 2001, and you see public confidence went up after we made that prediction and stayed high for the next 20 years or so. And so about 5 years ago, Jim Golby, who's a person I've collaborated with extensively on these topics, he and I said, let's look at why I was wrong. Public confidence seems to remain stubbornly high. So we started the project together, and this book is the final result of that. And of course, the irony is the conclusion of this book is that public confidence is high but hollow, which sounds an awful lot like brittle. I've reached the same argument. In the last 2 years, public confidence in the military has declined, 2-3 years. And so some of the things that I thought was going to happen in the late 90s and then didn't because we went to war are happening now as we are leaving the war frame. And of course, a lot of other things are happening as well. But the short answer is I set out to write this book to find out why I was wrong before. And
you found out you were just correct, but it just took a little longer. Ahead of your time.
I was just 25 years ahead of my time.
But whether you call it hollow or brittle, I think there's certain continuity to your concerns and your assumptions about the American people and what drives their trust and confidence. I want to get into all of that. But give me a sense of what surprised you most, perhaps as you looked at this. You wrote this knowing that you probably had a sensibility as to why your prediction back in September 10, 2001 didn't quite play out. 9/11, of course, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it just totally changed the context prior to. But as you went into research, and it's exhaustive, and the polling and the questions, I mean, it's really quite an accomplishment, and congrats. What kind of data did you see in there that you didn't anticipate finding?
So there were two things that I would flag here. One has to do with the hollowness aspect. Public confidence is hollow, I would argue, in part because the long-term props undergirding it are eroding. We'll get to that in a moment. And in part because it's propped up by something that's political psychologists call social desirability bias. And I expected to find some of evidence of the latter, but at least according to the survey, there's quite a fair bit of social desirability bias. That's when a respondent gives an answer they think that the pollster wants to hear rather than their real.
Yeah, you get to this later in the book, but let's just take a minute or two to unpack that.
Yeah,
it's a wonderful. As I read that, in some ways, it made me feel like this is good. Like, it's nice when people have the right instincts, sort of thing, right? And so, as I understand social desirability, you're about to explain it. right? It's where people think, okay, I'm supposed to be a supporter of the military. I am supposed to have confidence and trust in this institution. And that's the kind of the correct thing to say.
Right. In part because everybody else seems to have high confidence in the military, right? The American public doesn't know much about the military at all. But the one thing they do know is that other people have high confidence in the military. And that's true. It's even true today with confidence declining. It hasn't declined as much for the military as for other institutions. So it's still true today. Therefore, people kind of know it's the correct answer. And yeah, it's better for, political correctness to move better for those like you and me who want a strong military and want a military that's capable of commanding the confidence and the respect of the American people. It's better that the political correctness pressure is in this direction. But that's a hollow prop, because if a permission space develops where you can suddenly criticize the military and that becomes politically acceptable, then folks who didn't really have confidence now find it possible to reveal their true feelings. So
Got it. So it could swing quite easily if the conditions allowed for it.
Right. So this survey technique was designed to capture things like latent racism. So people who hold racist thoughts but know they are not supposed to say that to a survey pollster who's asking them. But of course, if they suddenly are in a setting where they're allowed to express that view, it comes to the surface. And I think part of the decline that we've seen in the last couple of years is a change in that permissive space. So for one segment of the population, it's now okay to criticize the military in a way that it wouldn't have been even 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
We're going to get that in just a second and
well, that surprised me. I knew we'd find a little bit. We found it as high as 7 to 25 points, and that's much higher than I expected.
Fascinating. All right, so we'll get that in a minute. But before we jump into the military, I would love for you to contextualize the military's place as an institution relevant or relative, to other institutions. Thinking about the U.S. Congress, the Supreme Court, law enforcement, the sorts of institutions that the presidency. When you're taking these surveys, or you're gelling in a lump together to see how military racks and stacks relative to others. So contextualize where the military fits in. And our experience here at the Reagan Institute, our survey, that they outperform all other institutions. But talk a little bit about that and kind of how that makes you think about the military.
All other federal institutions. So small businesses, that rate's fairly high. And it's not often asked on the same polls, but the U.S. Postal Service, believe it or not, is also ranks relatively high. But the major institutions of American politics, the Supreme Court, the Congress, the presidency, bureaucrats, generally, those kinds of major federal law enforcement, even all of those actors score low relative to the military. And confidence in everybody has declined. So all of them have gone down, but the military has remained, as the tide is going out for all of them, the military remains at the top. When I started in this business in the 90s, there were two at the top, the military and the Supreme Court. And so I would always say the military and the Supreme Court are held in high esteem, but not the other institutions.
Let's stick
the
with
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court's dropped a lot. Let's stick with that for a moment, even though it's not the focus of your great book, Thanks for Your Service, which you can be purchased on Amazon and any other place where you get books. There we go. We'll do that a couple more times, Peter, throughout the discussion. But it seems to me that perhaps there might have been a moment where political correctness dictated that people should say they support the Supreme Court, kind of taking the conversation that we started with, right? And that was the norm, even though maybe it was hollow. And then our politics and our national conversation allowed, maybe starting from the Bork confirmation and certainly beyond, to criticize the court. And then you see it's had this fall. Is that your assessment of things? And certainly, if we think in the news today, with the ProPublica assaults on whether it's Justice Thomas or Justice Alito, And certainly, you've had similar critiques, the other direction politically. It all seems to drive to the American people having a lower estimation and less confidence and trust in the Supreme Court.
In the 90s, the theory that I and others were advancing was that the Supreme Court and the military remained high in public esteem and Congress was low because the Supreme Court and the military were viewed as above and outside of partisan politics, whereas Congress is quintessentially a partisan institution. And it's always described as, what percentage Republican, what percentage Democrat. That's hardwired into the way the public views the Congress. It's partisan. Likewise, the president, nominally elected by everybody, but clearly a member of one party or the other. Traditionally, the Supreme Court and the military were considered nonpartisan. Over the last 25 years, though, the Supreme Court has increasingly taken on a partisan cast, and now is regularly described as, 6 Republicans, 3 Democrats, or whatever. And the more partisan it gets, the more people view it as, or the more partisan it is perceived to be, right, the more negative it's held. And that was viewed as a warning to the military. Do not develop a partisan cast. And in the late 90s, there was some worry that the military was. It was increasingly identifying with the Republican Party, its disaffection with the Clinton administration, and increasing willingness of the all-volunteer force to sort of reflect their partisan perspective, that historically the military had been independents, but increasingly they had aligned with one of the parties, Republican Party. There was a concern it might become partisan, and then public confidence will go down. In this book, we see evidence of some of that, but the stories, it's even worse than what I just described.
Tell us why.
Well, that is because the public is not a very good umpire about civil military best behaviors. So nerds on civil military relations like myself and others, we've developed a long list of do's and don'ts. And whenever we have a chance to talk to the military or civilian leaders, we say, here are your list of do's and don'ts, follow these rules, and you'll be adhering to best practices in civil military relations. The problem is the public does not know those norms, hasn't really thought about it. And if you prompt the public to think about it, they don't give the correct answer. And when it comes to partisan politics, they'll say, yeah, we don't want the military to be partisan. But when you probe what they mean by that, the public says the military is partisan when they agree with my partisan opponents.
Yeah. So give an example of this, because there's so much of this flying around right now, from this concern on the right about wokeness in the military, concern on the left, radicalism, and, this racist element in the military, to, uniform general officers and flag officers engaging in political activity or being with next to politicians, to retired officers. So give us a sense, and give me an example of where, the dynamic you just described is playing out today.
Well, you could go back further to say, when Trump asked the military to deploy to the border to defend the border, was that a legitimate military mission? Well, reasonable people can argue about it. Certainly defending the border is a legitimate military mission. Was that the best use of the active force? Did it make sense to mobilize a guard to do that? It sure felt like a political stunt. Reasonable people can debate it, but here's the point. Republicans, viewing that, thought that's the military behaving as they ought to. Democrats would say, no, that's the military being engaged in partisan politics. So even though the military was obeying a legal order from the president, to a Democrat, that looked like a partisan activity.
The border is a politically charged issue, immigration policy. And so once you insert the military, then it's going to either lead one to conclude they're being partisan, or one just to say, no, they're fulfilling their duty. And
then the White House changes hands. Democrats come in and say, okay, now we want you to do less of that and more of this. And now the Democrat respondents say, yeah, that's the military doing what it's supposed to do. And that Democrats and Republicans say, no, that's the military engaging in partisan.
Well, let's break this up and talk to all the different elements of it now. As you know, the Reagan Institute does a annual Reagan National Defense Survey. You've been helpful to us and give us advice and feedback over the years. We're grateful for that. In November 2022, so approaching a year ago, not quite there yet, found that only 48% of Americans had a great deal of trust and confidence in the military. What was eye-opening or significant, it was down 22 points from just 5 years ago. So, it was 70%, now 48% actually. It was really a period of 4 years when that happened because it flattened out between 2021 and 2022. So, the troops on the border example, Peter, that's been around for a long time. I mean, you had dynamic where President Bush was doing the same, and then actually President Obama did the same, right? It was viewed differently given where each president was on the immigration issues. But there seemed to, and it never really impacted, and it was always kind of a charged political issue. Not to dismiss your example, that was a good example. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is over this period between, say, 2017 and 2021, 2022, President Trump's in office. We see this huge decline, 2016, 2020 election. Give me your take and what your research in the book tells you about this particular moment in time and this precipitous decline. You've been looking at, you said at the outset, it was always hollow, but something happened to expose its hollow support.
Yes. It's not hollow all the way through. I mean, I think there is a fundamental reservoir that is legitimate pride in a military institution that is genuinely world class, first in class, world class. So I don't want to overstate the hollowness, but I think that the military needs to be careful not to drink their bathwater when they tell themselves repeatedly that they're the best trained, best equipped, best fighting force in history. Yes, that's true. Don't rest on those laurels,
right?
And think that you don't have to worry. And let me give a shout out to the Reagan poll. It's a very useful contribution to the debate. And I particularly admire your dominance of the press coverage. As someone working in the, laboring in obscurity in the salt mines on this topic, you guys come in and boom, everybody quotes the Reagan. It's especially valuable year over year. Yeah. So comparing your results, the one is in the field or about to go in the field, to last year's will be good compared to the year before is good compared to year. It's a little harder to compare from your survey to my survey because the question wording is slightly different. And sure. So we actually find the same basic dynamic. So I'm confident that we're both tapping into the same thing, but a one-to-one comparison is difficult because of the question wording. But what happened? I think what happened was President Trump's campaign calculation in September of 2020 to say, I'm so frustrated with Milley and the other, generals who have criticized me. So it wasn't just, Milley hadn't criticized him per se, but some former Trump officials had criticized him by that point. And it was obviously getting under President Trump's skin. And so in September of 2020, he went after his own generals and started criticizing his own generals. And he said, the rank and file are with me, but the generals, they're not. And that's because the generals like war and I don't want them to get into war. And the generals want war to sell weapons. And, he made some pretty dramatic charges that were, if you'll forgive me, very un-Reagan-esque. And, it sounded more like Reagan's critics than the traditional Republican line. That created a permissive space. That when I talk about permissive space for people who might have been, harboring anti-military sentiment to sort of say, okay, now I can, if my president's saying it, now I can say it, and he's a very influential figure, President Trump, former President Trump, but then President Trump, very influential in shaping Republican attitudes. So Republican mass tend to follow elite cues. And so there's no surprise that when he started that critique, and then other Republican prominent voices, Tucker Carlson, perhaps most prominent of all, echo it and reinforce it, then that drives down Republican support.
Even
And I
if the
think,
president, makes a distinction between, those general officers are bums, but I like the military, right? So
right,
and
yeah, yes, he's trying to draw a fine distinction, and I will say that from best practices in civil military relations, that's a very dangerous
right.
game he's playing there. Well, set that aside for its impact. One of the things that the book demonstrates is that the public does not draw the fine distinctions that you and I
Yeah.
draw.
Yeah.
So between active and retired, between senior and junior, yes, in the abstract they might know about those differences, but they all blur, and it's very hard for them to spot the difference and parse their attitudes accordingly. So I think it had a general decline. And then, of course, once Trump lost in 2020 and it's the Biden administration, then it's free fire for Republicans, because attacking the DOD is attacking the Biden administration, attacking DOD policies is attacking the Biden administration.
So
and we've reached this,
go ahead.
well, let me just say, we've reached this really odd moment in American politics where we've made the military combatants in the culture war, so that it's now acceptable to target the military, to shoot political fire at the military in what is essentially a culture war debate between two parties.
So let's move to that, because I think you're highlighting President Trump and his administration and how that impacted, in your judgment, and no doubt based on the polling, trust and confidence in the military. But there's also what's happening during the Biden administration. And, while we have this, as we're characterizing it before, elected officials, thought leaders, the commentariat critiquing the military, or is really essentially being just stuck in the middle of the culture wars. That's not new, right? I mean, Clinton administration, for example, and you were doing this work in the 90s, you had Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was highly controversial, and I think at the time viewed as kind of the social experimentation of the using the military for social experimentation and essentially putting them front and center in the culture war. Is this so, kind of with the historical lens, Peter? I mean, is this really different? Have we been down this road before?
We have. It's not entirely new. Nothing is new. One of the things I've learned,
right,
having collaborated with historians for the entirety of my professional career, is never say this has never happened before, because there's always a historian can find it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the 75th anniversary of Truman's decision to integrate African Americans into the military. Hugely controversial, roiled the senior brass, very politically divisive, at least at the civil military level divisive. But he did it, and it persevered, and eventually 75 years later we've got the fruits of it. So there is a precedent for using the military, for civilians to use the military as the vanguard in pushing forward, say, civil rights for African Americans. That was moving the country forward by integrating the military at a time when we still had Jim Crow laws in the South. So yes, there's some precedent for it. And in the 90s, advocates who wanted to move faster in terms of integrating open gays and lesbians in the service were critical of the military, in particular critical of General Powell for pushing back at that. So there was some pushback. But if you look, the more interesting comparison, Democrats criticizing the military, that's actually part of their DNA since Vietnam. So where it was a better comparison would be, how did Republicans handle when under President Obama they moved forward on all these issues?
Women in combat would be a big
women
example.
In combat, right? Transgender, very late in the game under Secretary Carter. These are they moved pretty far down the progressive path, the Obama administration, in terms of policies. Republicans protested the policies, but did not target the military per se in the way that it's happened now.
Good, interesting distinction. So, whereas, and you're right to raise the Obama administration, I had a chance. I was a staffer on Capitol Hill in the Armed Services Committee at the time, so I remember it well. It wasn't going after, the critique wasn't going after uniformed active duty military people. It was, for the most part, relegated to the civilian side, and the critique was the president, his administration, his appointees for advancing these policies. So that's an interesting shift. That now the critique is now the military has become almost kind of poisoned by this, and therefore the institution is somehow toxic or not worthy of our trust and support.
Right. And the evidence for it is pretty thin. I think what your poll for the Reagan Foundation poll from last year shows that when you ask Democrats to explain why confidence has gone down, Democrats will give MSNBC talking points. Yeah. And when you ask Republicans why it's gone down, they'll give Fox News talking points. And so the critique has penetrated, at least among partisan audiences. But there's not a lot of evidence to support that critique. So what's the evidence that the Biden administration is on a witch hunt to find extremists? Well, that's that one stand down from March or April 2021, 2 years ago. Okay, how's the quote unquote witch hunt gone since then? Not much evidence for it. You know, that was an understandable response to a very unprecedented. I'll say the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, that was unprecedented. No. That's a very unusual moment. This was an unusual response, but it hasn't turned into a witch hunt. Similarly, when you say, what's the evidence of, that the military's gone, quote unquote, woke, and then they'll say, well, they're emphasizing diversity. Well, the military has to recruit from all walks of life.
No, it's like the DEI training is the one that seems to get the attention of a lot of elected officials, right? I mean, that seems to get the scrutiny.
And actually, my view on this,
give it to us.
In an organization as large as DoD, I am confident that somebody is overdoing it in some capacity at any given point in time. An organization is large, you're going to find somebody who's overdoing it, and you're probably going to find folks who are underdoing it, who are not sufficiently as sensitive to how difficult it might be to be a serviceman or woman of color in the post George Floyd moment. That's a difficult moment to be an American of color, and there probably were military officials who didn't get that. Likewise, there's probably military officials who are overdoing these issues today. But if you look at the evidence in totality, it probably doesn't support the most extreme critiques, and yet the extreme critiques are penetrating and likely affecting public attitudes.
No doubt that I hear that. Another element in all of this, kind of going off script here a little bit, but for sure you have thoughts and views on it. It's the legislation as well. So, we're in a moment right now where perception, or the reality is, right, where the Department of Defense is going to pay for service members to fly to a state, for travel costs to get an abortion. If they are reside in a state which doesn't allow for, in the post Roe v. Wade world. The Department of Defense is, providing, right? They're concerned about the Department of Defense providing disproportionate amount of diversity, equity, inclusion training. So there's, a legislative language to pair that back to most, appropriate balance from the viewpoint of the legislator who's putting that, such an amendment forward. And the kind of other examples in terms of whether the military should be paying the medical expenses to transition for those seeking a transition for transgender. So you right now, reality or not, the reaction is playing out in the political branches with legislation moving forward. That is objective. That's real. That's not disproportionate. It's really happening. There's going to be a big debate. Usually it's over the defense policy bill, but it could happen in other legislative vehicles that absolutely, I would think, contribute to the sort of issues that you're measuring in terms of views of American people on these issues.
Yes, and let me just though put a sharper point on what you just said. We expect the military to salute and implement the law, even if or the policy, provided that the policy is legal. So the policy guidance and or the law, we expect the military to salute and implement that, even if they think it's a bad idea.
Yeah.
So as long as it's lawful, the military is expected to follow it. It could be lawful but awful. Doesn't matter. You're still supposed to do it. And take transgender policy. Just over the last 6 years, what the policy has been on that has flip-flopped multiple times. It was one thing early in the Obama administration. It was a second thing late in the Obama administration. Then it became a third thing when Trump reversed it, and a fourth thing when Biden reversed the Trump reversal. And each time we expect the military to move out and implement it. And so we as civilians have to therefore treat this as something precious that the military is willing to do, the flip-flop on a policy of some consequence. And the more pain we impose on them, in political point scoring on that, I think that's to our detriment. That's the first sharper, point I want to put on it. The second one is, these are issues that Congress has the power to decide, as you point out, by legislation. If they don't decide it, then the executive, so if they don't pass a law that says thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do that, it falls to the executive branch to implement the policy. And what got us into the current predicament, which led to Senator Tuberville's hold, which was the post Dobbs decision on healthcare that you were alluding to, there was not legislative restrictions. There was a norm about how it was handled, but there was not a legislative restriction that you could only do this or you had to do that. There was therefore some gray zone post Dobbs, and the DoD had a choice. They could have handled it quietly, just using the discretion that base commanders and service leaders have to handle these kinds of issues. That all the time, members of the services are being moved from one place to another to accommodate family needs or special health care needs, et cetera. So that stuff happens below the radar screen all the time. DoD could have handled this issue that way. Instead, they elevated it to a pretty prominent.
Oh, it's a huge standoff. This is an administration priority policy, and
it became it became a culture war rallying moment. And here's the point for our conversations. At that point, the military became hostages.
Yeah, they're the political football here, and it's going back and forth.
Yes.
And
that's the problematic thing. The policy debate is a legitimate one, and
it's a legitimate policy
Congress
debate,
could resolve it. Congress could resolve this policy debate. In the meantime, though, we're hurting the military.
And the military is viewed, and it's impacting the perception, people have of the military. In my own sense, and this maybe goes to Peter Feaver's rules for healthy civil relationships, or the civil relations, and that is, when the Congress or the administration, the executive branch and the legislative branch, attempt to push a social policy that there is no consensus in our country, or not even have to be consensus, but overwhelming majority. When it's a divisive issue, you're going to hurt the military, right?
Yeah.
And probably the better conduct is to wait for that moment where you're approaching consensus. An example in my mind of that, and I'd love to get your reaction to it. When the Congress repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell during the Obama administration, we were at a point where the country as a whole kind of felt
changed its mind. Yeah,
it changed its mind and felt, hey, we should allow and certainly allow for gay people to be open in the military. And sure, there were pockets in the Congress and the country that felt that was a problem. Maybe they were concerned about unit cohesion, how it would work in terms of the military. Ultimately, the goal, right, is to make sure the military can perform its core function, which is to protect and defend. But it seemed to me a moment where it was the appropriate time to legislate on the matter because it wasn't divisive. It didn't seem to be a political football. That seems to me like maybe the paradigm of how to deal with these tricky things. Is that naive, or you're not going to get to that point because rarely, will people wait until there's 60+% of the country with agreement on an issue?
Well, when there's a strong military effectiveness argument in favor of pushing forward, as there was 75 years ago on integrating African Americans, because World War II had proven that the arguments against integration were wrong. So Truman pushed forward before there was a consensus on it. And then it was rough sledding. There were race riots in the military in the 60s and early 70s. So I don't want to pretend that you just make the decision and all the problems go away. No, it was 70 years and we're probably still working through it today. But it was the right decision that pushed the country forward because there was a strong military effectiveness argument underlying it, which is that we needed the human capital that was resident in African Americans as well as all Americans, basically, to get them in the service. So my caveat to your rule, or my friendly amendment, is weigh the value of the military effectiveness argument. And the second, I don't know whether this will be a friendly amendment, but having criticized DOD for elevating the policy issue that then triggered the standoff with Tuberville, I'll point out that I do have some sympathy for the pressure they felt under, which was today in 2023, we depend on women in the military. We have to recruit women. Some of the topmost officers and talent in the military are women, and we could not meet our recruiting targets without women. And the fear that the Secretary of State had was that in the wake of Dobbs, if they waited until everyone figured out, 2 years later, what does this mean for how we're going to implement healthcare for, service women who are in Alabama, say, a lot of military in Alabama. So what are we going to do with them? If we wait 2 years for that, the impact on recruiting could be quite negative. And we're already in a recruiting crisis. So we got to do whatever we can, to put down the brush fires before they become a raging fire that consumes our recruiting capacity. And so that drove them to
strong point. John, we're with
in hindsight, though, they should have socialized it with Congress more. And that could they have persuaded Tuberville? No, but they might have done a better job of separating him from other, say, Republican hawks on the Hill who say, I'm with him on concerns about the pro-life issue, but I also don't want to use this tool to hurt the military.
Yeah. We're with Peter Feaver, author of Thanks for Your Service. We'll get to the recruitment crisis and kind of how your research and book informs it, and perhaps your thoughts on a pathway to get out of this crisis and build the military we need. But before we get there, I want to hit on two items. The first is in your chapter on politicization and your framework on this PI framework. I'd love for you to go through that. I thought it was a really smart and just kind of political science done right in my mind in terms of how you organize and think about it. The PI framework for politicization covers three issues, you're right: partisanship, that's the P, use of institutional credibility, and then electoral interventions. Just got to take us through that and how that's the helpful construct to think through this.
Right. So that's actually Jim Golby and Mara Carlin's framework. And Jim was a central partner in this project throughout. And so that was easy to adopt it. But um, so PI stands for partisanship, which is, back up, this is saying that when we talk about the military as being political or apolitical, that that terminology is problematic. Of course, the military is political in a bureaucratic politics sense, right? They're doing bureaucratic politics like every other bureaucracy. So, and you don't advance your career as an individual without having political skills and work in the system. So the military is political in that sense. They also have to be politically aware about what the president's trying to achieve and what are the pressures under him. They can't be blind to all of that. They're operating in a political universe, so they have to be politically sensitive. They should not be partisan. And the PI framework spells out ways in which they can fall off that horse and go from being politically sensitive to becoming partisan. And one of them is just P, the partisanship. If the military becomes captured by a party, so that to be a member of this party is to be pro-military, to be pro-military is to be a member of this party. If you're in the military, you're a member of this party, that kind of a close association. And there was some concern that that was where we were headed in the 90s, right? The so-called Republicanization of the military, which is something earlier work I had done with Dick Cohn had drawn attention to. Ironically, one of the things of the last several years, to include, Senator Tuberville's hold, is that I think the relationship between the Republican Party and the military is more complex today than it was 10 years ago.
I mean, you can find examples on either side. I mean, you want to make the argument that, the military's gone Democratic. You can find your retireds and others in the same direction on the Republican side.
So, well, I think one of the things that we've seen is that the military, which used to tend to think, okay, the Republicans have our back, they're going to boost our budget, and they're going to defend us against Democratic critiques. They might not be feeling that way so much in the last 1 or 2 years. And, candidly, the hold on all 300 of those general and flag officers, man, that's changing the way senior military are viewing the Republican Party. And so, but partisanship is one element of politicization. The second one is the use of institutional credibility, which is when military voices, particularly retired military voices, become more and more prominent in really partisan debates, debates over DEI, for instance, but also debates over Ukraine or Iraq. In late in the Bush administration, late in the Bush administration, civilians, to include President Bush, didn't have a lot of credibility to sway people's views. And so the Bush administration was glad that General Dave Petraeus did still have credibility. But that, of course, has the, secondary, maybe unintended and negative effect of politicizing in a partisan way. And the Democrats went after Dave Petraeus.
No doubt. You had, like in the name of the organization, full page ad.
MoveOn.org.
MoveOn.org. General Betray Us.
Yes. And you had Senator Clinton go after, basically call him a liar, in testimony.
Right. Oh,
yeah. So there was.
I kind of put an asterisk on those because it's wartime and it's kind of core to their. I could see how it could. Your point that it impacts trust and confidence and makes it partisan, but that type of conduct, General Petraeus, the commander in Iraq, coming in and making his case using his best professional military judgment before Senate congressional committees, I can kind of wrap my head around.
We had to.
Right. Military, retired, general and flag officers speaking at a political convention, it would seem to be.
That's the third category.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
That's the E of PI. That's electoral intervention, which is different from policy intervention. Okay. And this is where the campaigns, and both campaigns do it. Republican and Democrats were equally guilty. Will trot out military retired voices because their first name is still General or Admiral, right? And so in the mind's eye, in the public's eye, they might still be kind of military. And therefore enjoy the prestige of the nonpartisan military. But now here they're saying, look, this election's too important. You got to elect this person to be commander in chief.
Every 4 years, we seem to run into that election where it's too important. And each side has their lists.
And it's a tawdry spectacle, and it has the effect of politicizing the military in a partisan way. It doesn't have a big effect on shifting voters' attitudes, but it works just enough so that in a tight election, campaigns are like, we can't give up any tool. If we unilaterally disarm on this, our opponents are going to be able to take advantage and steal the march on us. So they keep doing it. I actually think we've crested. So I think 2012 was the high water mark in terms of numbers and luster of the names on both sides. 2016 was a low water mark in terms of that's when they went from just endorsing to actually criticizing. So you had Michael Flynn, retired 3-star, saying lock her up.
Right.
You know, that's the kind of attack job, attack dog role that's assigned to either the VP or to lower senators, and to give a distinguished military member like Mike Flynn that role, that was very partisan, and the reaction to that was quite negative. And so if you look at 2020, the list was much smaller in 2020 than in 2016.
Interesting.
And I'd be surprised. I bet the list in 24 is even smaller. If you look at the folks who, let's say Trump is the Republican nominee, the number of retired military who will endorse him, I think in a public way, I would expect it to be lower than what he was able to do in 20 or in 2016.
Interesting. One more item, and then I want to talk about recruitment crisis, and we'll wrap this conversation up. Early in the book, you talk about the generational divide over the military. Yeah. Numbers I have here is 61% of the silent generation, which is 74 years and up, expressed, quote, quite a lot of confidence in the military, compared to 27% for millennials and 31% for Gen Z. Is it the P, the I, the E, or something else that is driving the millennials and Gen Z to really have this pretty low level of support for the military?
Well, this is one of those things where, in my business, the last line of every paper is, we need more funding for more research. So, I hope that other scholars keep tracking it, because one question is, if you look, who has the highest confidence in the military today? It's the survivors of the Vietnam War. That, if you had said that in 1960s, late 60s, no one would believe you. So the question is that a aging effect where you just get wiser, in the same way that when you're young, everybody's a liberal, and it's not when you get older, everyone's a conservative. I forget who said that, but
Churchill, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. But maybe some confidence in institutions in the military is like that, so that the younger generation is just sort of feeling their younger oats. But there's also a sense in which the younger generation has experienced a different story than older generations had. They can't remember Desert Storm. They can't remember the early success in Afghanistan, the early success in Iraq. To the extent that they have a memory of military in the field, it's 2021's really catastrophic, not catastrophic, but chaotic.
Tragic, just withdrawal from Afghanistan. Yeah.
So the military, to be clear, the military performed, the Air Force in particular, performed operationally in a superb way, but the result on the battlefield was catastrophic. We were able to
not winning. I mean, the high water mark is the Gulf War. We won that handily. And we didn't occupy, and it was kind of a military win, and the kind of the moral high ground, all for us.
But so I think part of it is that, but it's also the case that the younger generation has lower trust in formal institutions across the board. So all of the institutions, and so there does appear to be a cohort effect that could linger. here.
So
because of
pull that, kind of use that as a bridge, as it were, to recruitment crisis, and where the
right. But
Army
here's the
is,
problem. Those are the
yeah,
people we're recruiting.
well, exactly where I was going, right? So the Army
Exactly.
right now is once again will not reach its recruiting goals, and they're going to actually reduce their targets for the incoming year in terms of what they're seeking in terms of active duty. So, we're at a point where we thought we needed 580,000 active duty Army. Now the Army is going to be in this 520 to 530, not because there was some strategic insight that said, oh, we need a smaller Army. It's because we simply can't recruit.
Right.
Lots of reasons for this: economy, health of our country and young people, propensity to serve, sort of thing. But there's got to be an element here, Peter, of a view of the military and people saying, I'm not interested.
Yes, you're absolutely right that confidence in the military is part of the story. It's not the number one factor, but it might be one that is more amenable to change than some of the other factors, right? The obesity crisis, well, that's going to be tough to fix, but maybe we can work on people's attitudes towards the military. And people with higher confidence in the military are more likely to recommend to others that they serve in the military. And so when confidence declines, you've got fewer people in the chorus encouraging young people to join. And that's a problem. And some of the reasons why people are not joining directly relate to confidence, in the sense that, particularly for women, there's a real concern about sexual assault, sexual harassment, and that also is linked to lower confidence in the military. And so there's a case where there's a genuine problem that the military has to grapple with and fix. If they fix it, confidence will go up, and also recruitment will go up. But the long pole in the tent for recruitment is still the economy, is still the eligibility of people to serve. It's still even the lingering effects of COVID. And so I won't abandon the all-volunteer force and say it's hopeless until we see how recruitment works during a period of an economic downturn. And I don't think the shift to a draft, which is often used as a let's do that, and that will also boost public connection to the military because they'll have the thing. I think that's a cure worse than the.
Well, AJ, I was going to hit you on that. It's 50 years this year in terms of when we went to the all-volunteer force, 1973. So good to hear that you still think that's the way to go. And,
it's in trouble.
It's in trouble.
We need to fix it.
Well, yeah. and here, particularly at the Reagan Institute, look at 1978, 79, it was pretty bad as well. A priority for President Reagan when he came to office was restore confidence and trust in the military.
Yes.
Not just in terms of the troopers, right? The airmen, sailors, soldiers, Marines, but also the country, to restore that pride in the military. And for him, it wasn't trust, confidence. He talked about in terms of pride. It worked. And that came, in some very tangible ways, budgets and equipment, but also was a leader who said, I'm going to personally invest in promoting this institution to the country with all the trappings of the presidency.
Right.
We haven't had that in a while, have we?
Well, I do think we need another Reagan-esque leader who will take this on as part of his or her responsibility, is to restore American confidence fully in the military, but also to have the military focus on deservedness so that they deserve confidence. They don't just prop up with rah-rah rooting. The military needs to be professionally competent, stay out of politics, be ethical in its treatment, and grapple with some of these challenges that they do face. But it may take a strong leader at the top. Remember a movie from early in Reagan administration, Stripes, and there the message was, if you fail at everything else, you can't even be a taxi driver, join the Army. That's what you can do. About 4 or 5 years later, you get Top Gun.
Stripes to Top Gun. Yeah, that's a great.
It's a very
I love
different
that.
vibe.
Yeah. All right, let's move to the lightning round. Again, thank you, Peter Feaver. Great discussion on your new book. Thanks for your service. So thanks for your book called Thanks for Your Service.
Thank you.
Here's where we ask all our guests to provide their favorite Reagan speech, quote, and book. What do you have to share?
I have to say my favorite Reagan book is Will Imboden's The Peacemaker. I wanted to troll him by mentioning something else, but he's my former colleague, and that's just a fine book. But
Amen.
it's also an easy for me to pick my favorite speech, The Boys of Pontotoc.
Mm.
I played Ronald Reagan in the D-Day staff ride that my group here at Duke did, and I got to deliver that speech, which was written by Peggy Noonan and delivered by President Reagan on June 6, 1984, at the 40th anniversary. It's one of the finest speeches of political oratory in the second half of the 20th century, one of his finest. And it was very moving to present it on
That's super cool
of Normandy. And there's two quotes from that I love. When he says, "These are the boys of Pontotoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." Just the cadences are wonderful. But the other quote from that is actually more timely to our moment is this: "The men of Normandy had faith that what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead or on the next. It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest." And I can't think of a better summary of the contest we face today as a country between those who want to use force for conquest, and they're out there, and the United States, which is trying to use force for liberation.
Peter Feaver, thank you for being on the show. Great quote.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.